years, what we have forgotten, long before the ships arrived with their crosses and their iron, long before the word vampire ever crawled from European lips, something moved through the forests of this continent. Something that understood blood not as symbol, but as currency, as fuel, as the thin red line between the living and whatever comes after. The oldest stories don't have names we can pronounce anymore. They exist in the spaces between words, in the silences that fall when elders stop speaking mid-sentence, their eyes drifting toward the tree line at dusk. These are not the stories told to children. These are the stories told to those who are about to make a long journey alone. Warnings disguised as wisdom. Instructions for survival written in the language of dread. In the time before time had a name, the Cherokee spoke of the Raven Mocker in whispers that barely disturbed the air. To speak too loudly of such things was to invite their attention, and their attention was the last thing any living person wanted. The Raven Mocker did not announce itself. It did not break down doors or shatter windows. It simply appeared at the bedsides of the sick, the dying, the vulnerable. It wore the shape of someone familiar, a grandmother, an uncle, a medicine woman from 3 valleys over. The face was right, the voice was right, but the eyes were too bright, too aware, too hungry. It came for the heart, not the physical organ, though sometimes that too was found disturbed, but for the years a person had left. The life force itself. It would lean close, so close its breath mingled with the dying person's last exhalations, and it would pull. The victim would feel their remaining time draining away like water through cupped hands. Days, weeks, months that should have been theirs, stolen in moments, added to the Raven Mocker's own existence. This was not mere killing. This was theft of the most profound kind, and when it left, it flew. Witnesses described the sound, a rushing of wings too large to belong to any natural bird, a call that echoed like both raven and human scream tangled together, diminishing into the darkness. By morning, the body would be cold. The family would mourn. The Raven Mocker would be elsewhere, wearing another face, waiting beside another bed. The Cherokee knew these beings walked among them. Not spirits from some distant realm, but things that lived in the same world, breathed the same air, walked the same paths. They simply fed differently. They required what ran warm and red and full of days, yet unlived. Travel south. Cross rivers that have no bottom at certain hours. Move through swamps where the air itself seems to pulse. The hunger takes different shapes here. The Tlahuelpuchi of central Mexico understood concealment in ways that made the Raven Mocker seem almost honest by comparison. These were not monsters in the night. These were your neighbors. The woman who sold herbs in the market, the midwife who delivered your children, the girl who smiled shyly from the doorway of her family's home. By day, they were human in every measurable way. They ate food. They laughed. They complained about the heat and gossiped about marriages and births. But at night, after the transformation, they became something else entirely. The change happened in private, always in private. The human skin would loosen like an ill-fitting garment. What emerged bore no resemblance to the woman who had worn it. Accounts vary, as accounts always do when fear distorts memory, but the pattern remains consistent. Something with feathers, something with talons, something capable of flight, something with an insatiable appetite for the blood of infants. The Tlahuelpuchi would drift through the night sky, lighter than smoke, searching. It could sense new life from great distances, the rapid heartbeat of an infant, the fresh blood still learning how to flow through untested veins. It would slip through the smallest gaps, cracks in adobe walls, spaces beneath doors, down through smoke holes in roofs. Parents would wake to find their child pale and still, 2 small wounds on the neck or chest barely visible in the dawn light. The official cause might be declared as sudden illness, evil eye, the will of the gods. But everyone knew. Everyone understood what had visited in the darkness. What made the Tlahuelpuchi so terrifying was not their power, but their permanence. They could not be cured or exorcised. This was their nature as surely as hunger is the nature of all living things. Some claimed they hadn't chosen this existence, that it had been thrust upon them at birth, a curse that lay dormant until puberty awakened it with all its dark requirements. Others whispered that the transformation was voluntary, a pact made in exchange for extended life and freedom from ordinary human constraints. The truth, if there ever was a singular truth, has long since dissolved into the murk of competing testimonies and cultural memory. But the dead children were real. Their drained bodies were counted. Their graves were dug. And the Tlahuelpuchi continued, generation after generation, feeding when the hunger demanded, returning to human form before sunrise, living their double lives with practiced ease. Go deeper, further back, to civilizations that built pyramids and charted stars and understood mathematics were still deciphering. They knew about blood. They knew its power in ways we've worked very hard to forget. Camazotz, death bat. The name alone carried weight in the cosmology of the Maya and the civilizations that preceded them. This was no mere symbol, no abstract representation of night or death. Camazotz was a god, yes, but gods in these traditions were not distant, ethereal beings. They were forces, presences, things that manifested in the world with terrible specificity. The House of Bats in the underworld of Xibalba was where Camazotz ruled. Descriptions from the Popol Vuh speak of a place dense with the sound of wings, the air thick with the musk of guano and old blood. The bat god himself was depicted with a blade-like nose, wings of stretched skin, clawed feet, and eyes that reflected no light. He decapitated the hero Hunahpu with a single strike, a clean removal of the head that suggested both precision and practice. But Camazotz was not confined to myth and temple carvings. Rituals dedicated to him required blood, fresh blood, human blood, The sacrifices were specific. Captives from warfare, usually, but also volunteers who believed their offering would maintain cosmic balance. They were led to sacred caves, entrances to the underworld, where actual colonies of vampire bats roosted in the thousands. The caves echoed with their movement, the ceiling alive, with furry bodies hanging in patient rows. The sacrifices were made at night, always at night. The victim's throat was cut, the blood collected in ceremonial vessels, but some was allowed to spill freely onto the cave floor where the bats could access it. And they did. They swarmed down in the darkness, their heat-sensing abilities guiding them to the still warm offering. The priests would chant while the bats fed, believing they were feeding Camazotz himself through his earthly representatives. But sometimes, witnesses reported, something larger moved in the deepest parts of the cave. Something that walked upright. Something that watched with intelligence that no bat, no matter how large, should possess. These reports were not official. They were not carved into stone or recorded in codices. They were shared mouth to ear, horror to horror, among those who had seen and could never unsee. The vampire bats of Central and South America are real, of course. Science acknowledges them. They feed on blood, preferring livestock now, but capable of feeding on humans when opportunity presents. Their saliva contains anticoagulants. Their teeth are razor sharp. They approach sleeping victims with remarkable stealth. All of this is documented, studied, understood. But the old stories suggest the bats themselves were merely echoes, diminished reflections of something larger. Something that chose the form of a bat, the way the Tlahuelpuchi chose the form of a woman. Something that understood humanity's fear of the night and used that fear as camouflage. The Amazon holds secrets in layers. Beneath the green canopy is perpetual twilight. Beneath the twilight is the forest floor where things rot and transform. Beneath that is water, black water, clear water, brown water thick with sediment and history. And beneath the water, or perhaps within it, are the things that learned to take what they needed while leaving barely a trace. The Asima of Suriname and Guyana understood subtlety. During the day, an Asima appeared entirely human, often an old woman, though not always. But at night, the Asima would shed her skin like a snake molting, peeling it away and hiding it in a safe location. What remained was a sphere of fire, a ball of flickering light that could slip through any gap, float across any distance. It would enter homes while families slept, hover over sleeping bodies and feed. The victim would wake with unexplained scratches, bruises, a profound fatigue that went beyond lack of sleep. Their blood had been sipped throughout the night, taken in quantities small enough to avoid immediate danger, but large enough to sustain the Asima's unnatural existence. If you found the discarded skin and rubbed it with salt and pepper, the Asima could not return to human form. She would be trapped as that ball of light, forced to flee before sunrise or burn away to nothing in the dawn. But finding the skin required knowing what you were looking for. It required believing such things were possible. Most people convinced themselves they had simply slept poorly, eaten something disagreeable, perhaps caught a minor illness. The alternative was too disturbing to accept. Further south, in the highlands where the air thins and cold settles into bone, the Pishtako walked. This entity has roots in Incan tradition, but persisted long after the empire fell. The Pishtako was said to be a pale figure, often described as white or light-skinned, which took on additional significance after European colonization, who would attack travelers on remote mountain paths. But the Pishtako did not want valuables. It wanted fat, body fat, and blood. It would slit the victim's throat or belly, drain the blood, render the fat, and disappear back into the high passes where the wind erased all tracks. The fat was said to be used for various purposes, lubricating church bells, making holy oil, even powering machinery in later versions of the legend. But beneath these rationalizations was the older truth. The Pishtako consumed. It required human essence, blood and fat being the most concentrated repositories of life force, and it took what it needed from those who traveled alone, who wandered too far from firelight and community. Bodies were found, not often, but regularly enough, drained, mutilated in specific ways, left in positions that suggested they had been examined, utilized, emptied of something vital. Authorities would investigate. Families would mourn. Warnings would be issued about traveling alone. And the Pishtako would wait, patient as stone, for the next solitary figure to appear on the path. These are not separate stories. They are variations on a theme, regional dialects of a single terrible language. From the northern forests, where the raven mocker flew to the southern mountains, where the Pishtako hunted, the pattern remains consistent. Something that appears human, but is not. Something that requires blood, life force, the essence that separates the living from the dead. Something patient, something intelligent, something that has learned over centuries how to hide in plain sight. The first European explorers to reach these shores brought their own stories of blood drinkers. Vampires from Slavic tradition, the Striga and Nosferatu, creatures that rose from graves and terrorized villages. But these European monsters seemed crude compared to what they encountered in the New World. The European vampire was often mindless, driven by base hunger, easily identified by its corpse-like appearance and grave dirt. The blood drinkers of the Americas were sophisticated. They planned. They integrated into communities. They chose their victims with care and strategy. They had been practicing this art for far longer than European folklore had existed. When Spanish conquistadors first penetrated deep into the Amazon in the 1540s, chroniclers recorded strange accounts. Indigenous guides would refuse to continue past certain rivers after dark. They spoke of lights in the forest that moved with purpose, that followed the expedition. They described finding bodies in the morning, bodies that had been alive and healthy the night before, drained of color, cold to the touch, with no obvious cause of death. The Europeans dismissed this as superstition, as fear of the unknown jungle. They had crosses and prayers and faith in their Christian God. What could harm them? But the deaths continued, and they followed a pattern the Europeans began to reluctantly recognize. The victims were always found at the edges of camp, always pale, always with a look of terror frozen on their faces. Sometimes there were marks, small punctures, scratches that seemed deliberately placed. Sometimes there was no visible wound at all, just the absolute certainty that something vital had been removed from the body. One account from 1559, recorded by a Jesuit priest traveling through what is now Colombia, describes an entire village abandoned overnight. 43 people gone, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, just empty huts and fires still warm, and a feeling, the priest wrote, that the air itself had been sucked hollow. Local tribes refused to enter the village. They said it had been marked by the night drinkers. They said the people hadn't been taken away. They had been consumed where they stood, so thoroughly that even their shadows were gone. The priest didn't believe this, of course. He recorded it as evidence of indigenous superstition, of the need for Christian salvation. But he never went back to that village. And in his private journal, the one not meant for his superiors in Rome, he admitted he had seen something moving through the trees on the journey away. Something that paced them. Something that watched with eyes that caught the moonlight like coins at the bottom of a well. The colonial period brought new opportunities for the blood drinkers. The Europeans built settlements in places the indigenous populations had deliberately avoided. They ignored warnings about certain valleys, certain caves, certain stretches of forest that had been left uninhabited for good reasons. They built their homes and churches and forts, and wondered why sickness plagued them, why children died inexplicably, why the settlements never thrived the way they should have. A pattern emerged in New England during the 1600s. Families would report a wasting disease passing through their members one by one. The first to die would be buried with proper Christian rites. But then another family member would fall ill, displaying the same symptoms: profound fatigue, pale skin, difficulty breathing, a sense of being drained from within. And the sick person would report dreams, always dreams, of the recently deceased family member visiting them at night, sitting on their chest, the weight of them making breathing difficult. A cold presence that seemed to pull warmth and vitality out through the skin. When the pattern became too obvious to ignore, families would sometimes take action. The coffin of the first deceased would be exhumed, and inside, instead of the expected decomposition, they would find a corpse that looked too fresh, too pink, too swollen with blood that should have settled and dried. The heart, when cut open, would contain liquid blood instead of the clotted mass it should have become. This was taken as evidence that the deceased was feeding on living family members from beyond the grave. The solution was brutal. The heart would be cut out and burned. Sometimes the entire body would be burned. The ashes might be mixed with water and fed to the sick family member as a cure. This was Christian New England, not superstitious old world folklore, but desperation breeds familiar responses. The sick sometimes recovered after these rituals. Sometimes they didn't, but the nighttime visitations would stop. The sense of being drained would cease. The family line would survive. The most famous case, though it occurred later in 1892, was that of Mercy Brown in Rhode Island. Her mother and sister had already died of consumption. Her brother was sick. Mercy herself died and was buried in the cold winter ground. But when her brother's condition worsened, and he reported dreams of Mercy sitting on him, draining him, the family exhumed her body. Despite having been dead for weeks in frozen ground, witnesses reported that Mercy's body showed minimal decay. That liquid blood flowed from her heart when it was cut open. That the corpse looked as if it had fed recently. Her heart was burned. Her brother drank the ashes in water. He died anyway. But the story spread. Newspapers reported it as evidence of lingering superstition, of ignorant farming communities clinging to vampire folklore. But what the newspapers didn't emphasize was how common these exhumations had been. How many families, across how many decades, had opened graves to find the dead looking far too alive. How many hearts had been burned in secret, the rituals never recorded, the shame too great to document. Were these actual cases of vampirism, or tuberculosis combined with decomposition gases that bloated corpses and gave them a false appearance of vitality? Science offers explanations, but science cannot explain the dreams. The identical reports, separated by decades and geography, of the dead returning to feed on the living. The weight on the chest, the sensation of being drained, the improvement after the exhumation and burning. Science cannot explain why certain families were targeted while neighbors remained healthy. Why certain bloodlines seemed cursed across generations. Why the pattern repeated with such precision. The indigenous populations knew. The Cherokee, the Maya, the tribes of the Amazon, they had always known. The Europeans brought new victims, but the predators were already here, had always been here, would always be here. The land remembered. The blood remembered. Move west. Into territories not yet mapped by European cartographers. Into the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, where trees grow tall enough to vanish into fog, where the ground is soft with centuries of decomposition, where the darkness beneath the canopy is absolute even at noon. The Tlingit and Haida spoke of the Kushtaka, the land otter people. These beings lived in the spaces between human and animal, wearing skins that could shift from otter to human and back again. They would lure people away from settlements, especially children, drowning them or driving them mad or transforming them into Kushtaka themselves. But some versions of the story, the older versions, included an additional detail. The Kushtaka fed. They required something from their victims beyond simple death. They drank, not always blood specifically, but something. Life essence, the spark that animates flesh. The boundary between alive and not alive was porous for the Kushtaka, and they existed in that porousness. taking what they needed from those who crossed their paths. Trappers in the 1800s reported encounters that matched these descriptions too closely for comfort. Men who disappeared near rivers and were found days later, alive but changed. They couldn't remember what happened. They spoke in fragments about being underwater but breathing, about hands that were clawed but also human, about hunger, overwhelming hunger, and the taste of copper. These men were never quite right afterward. They isolated themselves. They preferred night to day. They went back to the rivers eventually, all of them, and were never seen again. Southwest, among the Navajo and Apache, the concept of the Yinallushe, the skinwalker, carried similar weight. These were witches who had gained the power to transform into animals by committing the worst possible act, killing a close relative. Once transformed, they could become coyotes, wolves, foxes, owls, or even humans they had observed. But transformation was only part of their power. Skinwalkers could drain the life from livestock and humans alike, taking their strength, their years, their vitality. They were said to lock eyes with victims through windows, and the gaze itself was enough to begin the draining process. The victim would sicken, waste away, die of no identifiable illness. Reports of skinwalkers persist into the modern era. Navajo communities still speak of them, though rarely to outsiders and never casually. Police reports from reservation areas occasionally include witness statements that defy easy explanation. Figures that move too fast to be human. Animals that stand upright. Faces that appear at windows and vanish when confronted. Bodies found drained of blood with no wounds, no tracks, no logical explanation. The scientific explanations are offered. Coyotes, feral dogs, bears, misidentification in poor lighting. Cultural folklore creating expectation that shapes perception. But the reports continue, and the pattern remains too consistent, too specific, too tied to the old knowledge that something walks alongside humanity, wearing faces that aren't quite right, taking what it needs when it needs it. Consider the possibility that these stories are not metaphors, not cultural expressions of anxiety or explanations for diseases not yet understood. Consider the possibility that the stories are exactly what they claim to be: warnings, documentation, field reports from the long, slow war between humanity and the things that feed on humanity. The indigenous populations developed protections, rituals that worked not through faith, but through tested repetition. Certain herbs that repelled the blood drinkers. Specific arrangements of objects that created barriers they would not cross. Times of night when it was safer to be awake than asleep. Positions in which to sleep that made feeding difficult. Ways to identify someone who had been touched by a raven mocker or Tlahuelpuchi. Changes in the eyes, in the smell of the skin, in the rhythm of breathing. This knowledge was valuable. It was maintained carefully, passed down through generations, adjusted as the blood drinkers adapted their methods. Because they did adapt. They learned. If a herb worked too well for too long, they found ways around it. If a ritual provided protection, they waited until it fell out of practice, until people forgot why it was important. The arrival of Europeans disrupted this balance catastrophically. The newcomers ignored indigenous warnings. They built in the wrong places. They didn't know the protections. They were easy prey. And worse, they brought new susceptibilities. The blood drinkers discovered that European blood tasted different, that it sustained them in different ways. The mixing of populations created new opportunities for feeding, for hiding, for spreading. Disease epidemics that swept through indigenous populations after European contact killed millions. The official history attributes these deaths to smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. And this is true, but it is not the complete truth. Some communities reported sicknesses that didn't match known diseases, wasting illnesses that drained people overnight, plagues that left the dead looking not diseased, but emptied. Shamans and medicine people tried to fight back, but their numbers were diminishing. The knowledge was being lost. The young were dying before the old could teach them, and the blood drinkers, patient as ever, adapted to the chaos. They moved through the dying populations like sharks through churning water, feeding freely, knowing that in the confusion, no one would notice a few more bodies among the thousands. By the time the colonial period solidified into the American nation, the blood drinkers had perfected their craft. They had learned to blend completely, to choose victims who wouldn't be missed, or whose deaths could be attributed to the countless other ways humans died on the frontier: exposure, animal attacks, accidents, fever, violence. They fed carefully, never taking too much from one source, moving frequently, leaving patterns too subtle for the living to recognize. But patterns exist nonetheless. Compare a map of early colonial settlements that failed places established with resources and manpower that nonetheless died out within a generation, with indigenous maps marking territories they avoided. The overlap is striking. Certain river valleys, certain mountain passes, certain stretches of coastline. The Europeans built there anyway, and they died there in numbers that exceeded disease and starvation and conflict, in ways that left the survivors unwilling to rebuild, taking their fear with them to new locations. Compare records of unexplained deaths along the Appalachian frontier during the 1700s, bodies found drained of blood, pale beyond death, with expressions of terror, and the pattern creates a network, a route, as if something moved along the mountain chains, feeding at intervals, covering vast distances, never staying long enough to be cornered, but always remaining within the corridor of the mountains where settlements were isolated and help was days away. Compare reports of wasting diseases in New England families with the bloodlines most affected. Certain names appear repeatedly across centuries, as if they had been marked, as if once the blood drinkers found a family line that sustained them particularly well, they returned to that line generation after generation, cultivating it like farmers cultivate crops. The indigenous populations warned about this. They told the Europeans that blood calls to blood, that if you were fed upon and survived, you became a beacon. Your children would be susceptible. Your children's children. The mark went into the blood itself and could not be washed out. The Europeans didn't listen. By the time they understood, it was too late. The bloodlines were established. The feeding patterns were set. The blood drinkers had settled into a sustainable relationship with their prey, taking just enough to survive, but not enough to trigger organized resistance. And here is the terrible genius of it. They made themselves invisible by becoming ubiquitous. Every culture has stories of vampires, of blood drinkers, of things that feed on life force. These stories are so common that we treat them as universal human mythology, as metaphor, as the primitive mind's attempt to explain death and disease. We catalog them academically. We analyze them psychologically. We adapt them into entertainment. We never consider the alternative, that the stories are common because the predators are common. That every culture has these stories because every culture encountered the same entities. That the variations in description reflect different regional species of the same fundamental thing. That the reason vampire folklore never dies is because vampires never died. They simply evolved their camouflage. In the modern era, they are invisible, not because they hide in castles or sleep in coffins or fear crucifixes and garlic. Those are the superstitions we comfort ourselves with, the idea that vampires are constrained by rules and repelled by common objects. The truth is simpler and more terrible. They are invisible because they look exactly like us. They have learned to take only from those whose blood won't be investigated. The homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, the undocumented. The people society has already decided don't matter. A body found in an alley, drained and pale, it's an overdose. Exposure. Just another casualty of a system that crushes people every day. Missing persons who vanish from national parks, from hiking trails, from campgrounds. Thousands every year. Some are found eventually, dead from exposure or injury. Many are never found at all. The official explanations involve getting lost, animal attacks, accidents. But a subset of cases defies these explanations. Experienced hikers vanishing in good weather on well-marked trails. Bodies found in locations already searched multiple times, positioned strangely, drained of color. Missing shoes, but otherwise clothed. Or clothed, but missing shoes. Small details that repeat across unconnected cases, as if following a pattern only visible from a great height. Medical examiners note unexplained blood loss. Bruising that doesn't match any known cause. But these observations rarely make it into official reports. They're anomalies attributed to decomposition or scavenger activity, or simply not understood because we don't want to understand. We have built a civilization on the assumption that we are the apex predators, that nothing hunts us, that we have dominion over all other forms of life. To acknowledge the blood drinkers would require admitting we were wrong, that we are not alone at the top, that something has been feeding on us since before we built the first city, and it continues to feed on us now, in the spaces between our certainty and our fear. The old knowledge is almost gone. The Cherokee elders, who knew the true nature of the Raven Mocker, have mostly passed. The few who remain speak carefully, aware that the wrong listener might be more than just skeptical. The families in New England who once knew to exhume and burn have forgotten why their ancestors did such things. The Navajo communities that still understand Skinwalker's guard that knowledge tightly, sharing it only with those who need to know, who will treat it with appropriate fear. But the blood drinkers remember. They have perfect memory because they have perfect patience. They know which bloodlines are most nourishing. They know which individuals are most vulnerable. They know who will be missed and who won't. They know how to read medical records, police databases, social media. They know everything about us because they have been studying us for thousands of years. And we know nothing about them because we decided they don't exist. Somewhere in America tonight, someone will die in a way that doesn't quite make sense. The blood loss will be noted, but not explained. The expression on the face will be wrong for the supposed cause of death. There will be small details, marks that don't match anything on record, a positioning of the body that suggests it was examined, a complete absence of defensive wounds despite clear signs of terror. The case will be filed, maybe investigated briefly, ultimately closed due to lack of evidence or attributed to the most convenient explanation. The family will mourn, the friends will move on, the community will forget, and something will move to the next feeding ground, patient and practiced, leaving behind only the faintest trace of what actually happened. A trace too small for the living to notice, but large enough for the next predator to recognize, to know that this territory has been claimed, that this bloodline has been marked, that the ancient work continues. The land remembers what we have forgotten. The blood remembers what we refuse to know. And in the space between forgetting and refusal, the blood drinkers thrive, not as monsters from folklore, not as supernatural entities bound by mystical rules, but as hunters who have perfected their craft over millennia, who understand their prey with devastating intimacy, who have learned that the best hiding place is in plain sight, and the best disguise is the one we convince ourselves to ignore. They were here before us. They will be here after. And in the eternal present between before and after, they feed, carefully, sustainably, with the infinite patience of predators who know that prey populations must be maintained, that killing, too, obviously brings unwanted attention, that the most successful hunters are the ones nobody knows to hunt. The stories tried to warn us. The indigenous knowledge tried to protect us. But we are modern. We are rational. We have science and technology and certainty. And so we continue to die in ways we cannot explain, in patterns we refuse to see, marked by bloodlines we don't believe in, fed upon by predators we insist don't exist. The raven mocker flies tonight. The Tlahuelpuchi sheds her skin. The Pishtako walks the mountain paths. Camazotz stirs in his cave. The Kushtaka waits by the river. The skinwalker locks eyes through the window. And we sleep, and we dream, and we wake tired, drained, marked, chosen. Or we don't wake at all.